virtue, practical wisdom, and eudaimonia. Or more precisely, we probably should say that there are two prerequisites, virtue and practical wisdom, and with those you can accomplish eudaimonia. Let's talk about each in turn. First, there is virtue. Many accounts of the virtues exist. Some were developed by medieval thinkers such as Aquinas, others by modern philosophers such as André Comte-Sponville, but perhaps the most famous account belongs to the ancient philosopher Aristotle. He revered virtues like honesty, courage, justice, temperance, and generosity. Virtue, Aristotle suggested, is often found in the mean, the average between deficiency and excess. For example, courage seems to be the middle point between cowardice and foolhardiness. A coward will never do a brave thing, but someone who is foolhardy will put herself at unnecessary risk, perhaps wasting her effort in life on a task that she should know is impossible. A firefighter who would never run into a burning building to save a person is a coward. A firefighter who would run into a building that is seconds from collapsing is just foolhardy. The firefighter who rushes in to save someone knowing it's risky, but that there is a decent chance of success, is courageous. But in virtue theory, to be virtuous is not simply to engage in virtuous actions. After all, a firefighter who saves people merely for glory and adoration would not really be virtuous. To be virtuous is to be a certain kind of person, to have certain emotional reactions and values and attitudes and sensibilities, and to ultimately choose virtuous actions for their own sake. For example, to be an honest person is not merely to habitually tell the truth. To paraphrase the philosopher Rosalind Hursthouse, it is to be someone who recognizes honesty as valuable and who understands that something's being true is a strong reason to prefer it. It is to associate with honest people, encourage honesty in others, and pity those who succeed because of dishonesty. It is to value honesty down to your core. You may not even value honesty by name, or even have the concept in mind as you act, but as long as you clearly value what we would call honesty down to your core, you are honest. Now, for obvious reasons, it's likely impossible to be perfectly virtuous, to embody all of the virtues all the way down to one's core. Fortunately, virtue does not require perfection. Being virtuous comes in degrees, so we can shoot for perfection by always trying to cultivate a better appreciation of the virtues, and in this way, we can always be on our way to becoming more virtuous. Indeed, becoming a virtuous person requires a lot of training and practice. So, moral education and development are very important parts of virtue ethics. We have to practice right behavior, surround ourselves with others who do the same, and expose ourselves to virtuous teachings if we're to get in the habit of acting virtuously and value the virtues for their own sake all the way down to our core. But this would seem to mean that when a virtuous person acts virtuously, they have no problem finding the motivation to do so. Being honest isn't just something that an honest person wants to be. It's something that is second nature to them, something that they can't help being. But this, it seems, might create a problem. Imagine someone who has to struggle to do the right thing because they aren't virtuous, but they go ahead and do the right thing anyway. Now, don't they deserve moral credit for what they did? In fact, don't they deserve more moral credit than the person who just does the right thing automatically? After all, the person who struggled had to work harder to do the right thing. Yet virtue theory would tell us that the virtuous person, the one who didn't struggle to do the right thing, is more deserving of moral credit. That doesn't seem quite right, does it? Well, the modern philosopher Robert C. Roberts seems to resolve this objection to virtue theory nicely in his article, Willpower and the Virtues. In a nutshell, he suggests there are two different kinds of moral credit. One for actions that involve no internal struggle, because the person's already virtuous, so they just do it automatically, and one for actions that do involve a struggle, those that require willpower. And both are morally praiseworthy. So, even if a young firefighter hesitates before rushing into a burning building, his action is still praiseworthy. Indeed, it could even be a part of his moral education. Perhaps eventually he won't hesitate and will be praiseworthy for a different reason. In fact, the virtue ethicist could even admit that in some cases, internal struggle may be more praiseworthy. It shouldn't always just be automatic to do the right thing. As my colleague at King's, Regan Reitzma, pointed out to me, even a soldier who knows that he's fighting on the side of justice ought to have at least some mixed feelings about killing his enemy if he's virtuous. At the very least, he should regret that such an action is necessary. Perhaps even the most virtuous firefighter should at least twinge a bit before rushing into a burning building, because he should value his own life just like he values the lives of others. By itself, however, being virtuous is not enough to guarantee virtuous behavior. The firefighter who rushes into a building seconds from collapsing isn't courageous, but foolhardy. He needs to know that there is at least some chance of success. So courage, and virtue in general, seems to require a certain kind of knowledge. Knowing that a rescue is possible is an example of what virtue ethicists call practical wisdom, what Aristotle called phronesis. Although this is not a consequentialist theory, virtue ethics is not, a virtuous person does want to accomplish certain virtuous things, like saving lives, or on a more abstract level, like they want to instill the virtues in themselves and others. They want to accomplish that. They want to accomplish behaving virtuously. And simply valuing a virtue down to your core is not enough to guarantee you'll always accomplish those goals. You have to know which actions are likely to accomplish them. Practical wisdom also involves the ability to evaluate a situation fully and consider multiple conflicting possibilities and other relevant virtuous goals. Even though a virtuous person will value honesty, they won't tell the truth in every situation. Practical wisdom will allow them to recognize when a lie is actually the more virtuous option. The virtuous person, for example, knows to lie to the axe-wielding murderer at the door looking for their friend or their mother. In fact, practical wisdom may spur them on to even better behavior. They may not know only know to lie in this situation, but they also may figure out how to trick the murderer into turning himself in with a clever lie, say by telling them that their mother is across the street at the party, a party at which they happen to know there are a number of police officers who would recognize the axe murderer as someone to arrest. In fact, recall the intellectual virtues that we talked about at the very beginning of the course. Intellectual humility, intellectual honesty, valuing truth intrinsically, and so on. These intellectual virtues are involved in practical wisdom and are often valued for their own sake. Part of being virtuous and even possessing practical wisdom is possessing those intellectual virtues. What's more, practical wisdom can prevent you from being virtuous to a fault. Someone can be too generous, giving away everything they own and thus causing themselves and their family to fall into abject poverty. Someone can be too honest, telling others true but unnecessarily hurtful things. In addition, virtue can sometimes help one in performing vices. Certainly, intellectual virtues can help one figure out how to do evil actions, and one might also engender the virtue of determination in his effort to perform a heinous action. In a certain sense, suicide bombers display courage when they blow themselves up for their cause. But we wouldn't say that they are truly virtuous because they lack the practical wisdom to realize that their cause is not virtuous and it's not worth dying for. To once again borrow from Rosalind Hursthouse, we can think of practical wisdom as the kind of wisdom that comes through life experience. Through living life, we learn what kinds of things are worthwhile and what kinds of actions are likely to succeed. Practical wisdom is the sort of wisdom that an adult has, but that, say, a child lacks. Children can have the disposition to behave honestly and generously or even courageously, but we usually would not call them virtuous or admirable until they gain the life experience to effectively act on those character traits and succeed in accomplishing virtuous aims. To understand the difference, consider a situation in which you have a friend over who is, say, going through a rough time, maybe a particularly bad divorce. You want to help her through this rough time, and as a virtuous person, you do so by simply listening or offering consolation and perhaps even some gentle advice. Your young daughter also wants to help her through this rough time, so she offers to give your friend her only DVD copy of the movie Frozen. Watching it always makes her happy, she reasons, so it will make your friend happy as well. As sweet as this may seem, we would not consider the action virtuous, certainly not as virtuous as your actions. Again, although she is sweet, she lacks the practical wisdom to know the kind of help that your friend actually needs in this tumultuous time. The daughter can't be faulted for her actions in this circumstance. However, she can't be expected to know any better because she's just too young. We wouldn't discourage her action. We would simply want to encourage her to develop practical wisdom as an adult so that the virtue of care she's displaying now can be coupled with the appropriate actions in the future. Notice that if she tried as an adult to help a friend of hers going through a divorce by giving her a copy of the DVD Frozen, we would no longer think it was sweet. By then, she should know better. And indeed, many adults do lack this kind of practical wisdom, and we find them morally deficient when they do. In general, we might say that the goal of the virtue ethicist is to be a good person and to live a good life, and you can't do that if you're a dupe, if you're insensitive to context, if you're ignorant of the relevant facts, or even unaware that there may be more than one good response in a situation. Practical wisdom is necessary to appreciate what is truly worthwhile in life and to accomplishment. It's necessary to live well. But that leads to the next question. What exactly is the good life? What is it to live life, the kind of life that is truly worth living? What is it to live well? That brings us to the third concept essential to virtue ethics, eudaimonia, a Greek word popularized by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. It has various translations, but most are inadequate. It's not merely a momentary subjective mental state like happiness. Eudaimonia is an objective condition of one's life. Just like someone might think they're healthy when they're not, someone might think they've attained eudaimonia when they haven't. Right? Nor is eudaimonia merely flourishing. After all, an animal can flourish but not have the kind of life that is most worth living. Likewise, someone with a lot of wealth and power might be thought to be flourishing. But for Aristotle, neither wealth nor power are even necessary to live the best kind of life. Perhaps well-being is the most accurate translation of eudaimonia, but it's also not that informative. That's like saying it constitutes the good life, but there are so many different ways that life can be good that really doesn't tell us much. For Aristotle, eudaimonia consists in fulfilling one's function. A hammer that is good at hammering, at driving in nails, fulfills its function. To find something's function, we should look at what makes it unique. What defines a hammer's function is being able to drive in nails. For Aristotle, what makes humans unique is our ability to reason. So we fulfill our function for Aristotle and have a eudaimonic life by living in accordance with reason, by using reason well. Just like a hammer is a good hammer by effectively driving in nails, a human is a good human by reasoning effectively. So for Aristotle, doing philosophy is an important part of the best kind of life. But Aristotle's is not the only conception of eudaimonia that exists. The Stoics and Epicureans not only disagreed with Aristotle about what the virtues are, but also about what was required for eudaimonia. For example, Aristotle thought that accomplishing eudaimonia is not completely up to you. Although virtue is necessary, it isn't sufficient. Misfortunes that leave you unable to act in accordance with reason throughout your life, for example, a crippling accident, could prevent you from attaining eudaimonia. The Stoics, on the other hand, suggested that being virtuous was sufficient. Indeed, for the Stoics, accepting what you cannot control, like misfortunes, and instead focusing on what you can control is an essential part of attaining eudaimonia. Some feminist philosophers, like Annette Baer, in her 1985 book, Postures of the Mind, argue that traditional Aristotelian virtue theory is far too masculine. Philosophy in general, feminists argue, has been primarily dominated by dead white males and fails to recognize the contributions of women. Virtue ethics in particular seems to emphasize cold, objective, impartial male virtues such as justice and fairness and autonomy, and neglects the more feminine virtues such as caring, patience, nurturing, and self-sacrifice. Utilitarianism, for example, calls one to value every person's happiness equally. So if you have a choice between making 20 strangers happy or just your own child happy, you should choose the strangers. That seems ridiculous, these feminists suggest. We want to and should show preference for those closest to us, for those who we care about. This is why this sort of feminist ethics is often called the ethics of care. It would be morally acceptable, in fact, even morally preferable, for me to save my child from an oncoming train instead of 20 strangers, or instead of your child. And the same would go for you. So even though they do not outright reject the classical virtues, a feminist conception of the good life may look very different than Aristotle's. But now we wonder, how can we tell who's right? For example, whose statements about what the virtues are is correct? If we could identify some kind of truth maker for such statements, that would solve our problem, but we know how difficult that's going to be. Debate on this issue might be useful and good arguments can be given, but most likely it's going to bottom out in some kind of intuition or assumption, likely grounded in some philosophical or religious tradition. So how can we tell what the virtues truly are or what eudaimonia requires? This is where the concept of moral exemplars comes in handy. A moral exemplar is a morally outstanding person that we look up to. For many virtue ethicists, such as Linda Zagzebski, an important part of our attempt to become more virtuous is learning about and surrounding ourselves with and trying to emulate moral exemplars. Indeed, according to her 2010 article, Exemplarist Virtue Theory, we shouldn't so much figure out how to act by imagining what a moral exemplar would do in our circumstances. We should discover what the virtues are by looking at the virtues that moral exemplar embodies. Interestingly, moral exemplars might not even need to be real. In an article entitled The Virtuous Batman, which I wrote with a friend of mine from grad school, Indy Rhodes, we argued that fictional characters like Batman can be moral exemplars. In virtue ethics, the function of a moral exemplar is simply to be something or someone that you can emulate to make yourself more virtuous. If a fictional character is virtuous, then imitating that character will make you more virtuous. The fact that the character doesn't actually exist is irrelevant. This, however, brings us to an objection to virtue theory. How are we supposed to identify, know who is a moral exemplar? Presumably, they are the people who are virtuous. They are supposed to teach us what virtue is. But unless we already know what virtue is, how can we tell the good exemplars from the bad? We can't identify exemplars without knowledge of the virtues, but we can't know the virtues without identifying the moral exemplars. We're stuck in a circle that we can't even start. So, although we may be comfortable with certain intuitions about the virtues, as an ultimate guide to how we ought to live our lives, virtue theory seems to fall short. And while we're considering objections, one of the most interesting objections to virtue ethics is the suggestion that it's self-effacing, that it cancels out its own value or contradicts itself. If a person truly is virtuous, then they shouldn't act in the name of virtue. To explain, let me borrow an example mentioned in Michael Stalker's 1976 paper, The Schizophrenia of Modern Ethical Theories. If you visit a friend in the hospital, you better not do it simply because that's what a virtuous person would do. If your friend finds that out, she'll be sorely disappointed. You should do it because you care for the person, not because you want to emulate how a virtuous person would act. So even if virtue does define morality, to act morally, you can't simply be acting in the name of virtue. Interestingly, this objection applies to our other theories as well. You'd better not visit your friend in the hospital simply because God told you to, or because you think it would produce the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, or because you would will that everyone act in the same way. Even if any of these is what makes an action moral, that can't actually be our motivation for doing the action if the action is going to be morally praiseworthy. So this problem is not unique to virtue ethics. However, the response to this objection actually helps us better understand virtue ethics. The virtue ethicist will likely suggest that the motivation behind a morally praiseworthy action done for another person needs to be the fact that you care for that person. So perhaps only if you've engendered the virtue of care or nurturing in yourself might you actually be able to visit your friend in the hospital for the right reason. Another objection identified by the modern philosopher Christopher Toner is similar, that virtue ethics is too self-centered. Morality is very much about other people, and the moral acceptability of a behavior is largely determined by how it affects others. Yet virtue theory seems to be centered on the individual actor, whether they are virtuous and whether that virtue constitutes their leading a good life. But again, the response to this objection helps us better understand virtue theory. It seems to mistakenly think that those who are virtuous care only about being virtuous, when in fact, being virtuous can make one care about a host of other things, including the welfare and well-being of others. This objection underestimates how other-centered most virtues make a person, and indeed how dependent on others a life of eudaimonia is. In fact, virtue theory may be the best way to to accomplish two goals with one effort, to do what's required by morality and be centered on others, and yet also do what's required by your own self-interest. By being virtuous, you can both be self-centered and other-centered. But one worry remains. If eudaimonia requires instilling virtue, and instilling virtue requires training, then what about those who don't have access to such training? What about those of us who lack access to moral exemplars, or who are exposed to corrupting environments? Is whether one is virtuous really just kind of a matter of moral luck? The obvious response is simple. Yep, sure is. Whether you are virtuous is a matter of luck. It's largely a matter of whether you're exposed to the right kind of things that will make you virtuous. But that doesn't prevent being virtuous from being the best way to live. That doesn't keep virtue from being necessary if you want to lead the best kind of life. It just means that life isn't fair, that not everyone has an equal opportunity to live the best kind of life. And probably that's not all that surprising. Now, you might be tempted to think that, everything else be damned, if you just simply are willing and try hard enough, well, then you can be virtuous. But that would neglect a long list of problems that we talked about when we discussed free will. A whole host of evidence and arguments suggesting that whether or not you're willing and whether or not you will try hard enough to be virtuous is not up to you. Even whether you care to emulate moral exemplars, or whether you can, as the Stoics suggested that you should, accept what you cannot control and focus on what you can, is not up to you. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, but ultimately, all such things are dictated by your brain structure. And that's a product of your DNA and your environment. And this brings us back around to wondering whether anyone could be held morally responsible for their actions. If whether one is virtuous is dictated by things beyond one's control, should the virtuous get moral credit for their virtuous actions? Well, one way to deal with this worry is to simply draw a distinction between being morally deficient and morally blameworthy. Someone programmed by his environment to be a murderer may not be morally blameworthy for his actions, but we could still see him as morally deficient, as someone who does not embrace the virtues. Likewise, a virtuous person may not get moral credit for their virtuous actions, but we might still say that they are morally upstanding. But yet another way to deal with this worry would be to embrace our old friend compatibilism, to suggest that we act freely as long as our actions spring from some aspect of ourselves, like our character, and to suggest that one is morally praiseworthy when the character from which one's actions spring is virtuous. Indeed, virtue ethics may be more in line with compatibilism than any other ethical theory. Not only does the virtue ethicist, like the compatibilist, admit that our behavior is ultimately a result of our genetics and environment, we become virtuous people by being exposed to virtuous education, but both admit that moral evaluations of actions are best understood as moral evaluations of the character, the wants and desires, and even the rationality from which those actions spring. So, virtue ethics takes an entirely different approach to the question of ethics. Instead of being an attempt to become a good person by figuring out which actions you should perform, you can come to know which actions you should perform in real-world situations by becoming a good person, a virtuous person. And your virtuousness will supposedly lead to eudaimonia, the kind of flourishing life that is most worth living. But what if it doesn't? What if being virtuous, in a particular case, does not lead to the best kind of life? After all, no good deed goes unpunished, right? What if you're a virtuous person, but things haven't gone your way and your life sucks? What if you're actually a virtuous person, but everyone else thinks and treats you like a criminal? And what about the fact that most often, the most rewarding life often seems to be led by the person who is willing to cheat to get ahead, so who isn't virtuous? What about the fact that some people can fool everyone into thinking they're virtuous when in fact they really aren't? Is it really worth it to be virtuous? Would you really be better off being the virtuous person in that circumstance? Or would your life be better if you were the immoral person who was thought by others to be virtuous? It is Plato's answer to these questions, which he gives us in one of his most famous works, The Republic, that will serve as our transition between the ethical questions of this section and the political questions of the next. Last time, we considered virtue ethics. which suggests that we should concentrate less on trying to figure out which actions are moral or immoral, and focus instead on figuring out how to be a virtuous person. This is how virtue ethicists think that we can be happiest, how we can attain eudaimonia, flourishing or well-being, and realize our true potential, how we can live the best possible life that we can live. But, at least according to some virtue ethicists, like Aristotle, being virtuous is only necessary for attaining eudaimonia. It is not sufficient. There's a little bit of luck involved, he might say. You can't be virtuous unless you can find virtuous people to help instill the virtues in you, and sometimes that's just a matter of luck. And something like a crippling accident could also prevent you from living the best kind of life. Or maybe a loved one suffers an untimely death. That could make eudaimonia impossible to accomplish as well. Or maybe you're just so ugly that you have no loved ones in the first place. Nah, I'm sure you're fine. But this leads to an interesting question. What if you had to choose between being a virtuous person who suffered many hardships and being a wicked person who had it easy? Consider the difference between someone who devotes himself to virtue and lives a life of poverty and hardship as a result, and someone who devotes himself to materialistic gain and lives a life of luxury. Take it a step further. Who's better off? Someone who actually lives a life of virtue and faces hardship as a result, including the hardship of being scorned by the public and even being considered an unvirtuous person by the public? Or someone who actually is unvirtuous but lives a life of luxury and adoration as a result, and is even considered to be a virtuous person by the public? Now, it's difficult to think of a popular modern example of someone in the real world who fits the first description of being truly virtuous but being scorned by the public. After all, if they're scorned, they likely don't receive much attention. Perhaps doctors and nurses who worked with Ebola patients in Africa but who were feared to have brought back Ebola to the US, that might qualify. They showed great courage to do such work, but then were kind of shunned and vilified by the public back home when they returned. Unvirtuous people revered as virtuous people by the public, on the other hand, are a little bit easier to identify. Think of Jim Baker, the televangelist who was revered as a virtuous Christian, but who turned out to be a thief and an adulterer. He robbed his followers of millions and had an affair with Jessica Hahn. Plato, however, provides us with the best example of a virtuous person who lived a hard life and who was scorned by the public as an unvirtuous person: Socrates. Using his devotion to the intellectual virtues, Socrates strove daily to understand all the virtues so that he could be virtuous. He taught others, but never charged a fee. In fact, his quest for virtuousness left him fairly impoverished. Yet Socrates was largely hated by the public. In his quest for knowledge, he sought out others, but in doing so, he exposed their ignorance. He exposed the fact that although they said they knew what the virtues were, they didn't truly know. Philosophy can do that. Philosophy can be very abrasive, and philosophers are sometimes not liked because of that. Just with Socrates, eventually he was brought to trial in Athens and was put to death. He truly was virtuous, but he lived a hard life as a result and was considered unvirtuous and reviled by the public. Compare Socrates to Gyges of Lydia, who, according to myth, found a ring that made him invisible, kind of like the one ring that made Bilbo and Frodo invisible when they wore it in Lord of the Rings. In fact, I often wonder if the Gyges myth isn't where Tolkien got that idea. But according to the Gyges myth, instead of destroying the ring in the fires of Mount Doom, Gyges used his ring of invisibility to nefariously and secretly seduce the king of Lydia's wife, and then become king himself. Yet, since he was able to do all of these dastardly deeds while invisible, he made it look like all of this good fortune just fell into his lap. and everyone revered him as a great and virtuous man. As Glaucon, the brother of Plato, recounts in the Republic, the worry is this: most people believe that acting unjustly, being able to take what you want without paying, killing your enemies, freeing your friends from jail, and usurping the throne and stealing the king's wife, really, that would guarantee happiness in life if it weren't for the public scorn and ridicule that accompanied getting caught doing such actions. But if you could do all that without being caught, say, because you could be invisible, then you could and would do them and be much happier as a result, live a better kind of life even. In reality, he says, virtue only seems to lead to a better life because it gets you the benefits of being recognized as a virtuous person. So Glaucon suggests, wouldn't many suggest that it's actually better to not be virtuous, but just to be regarded by the public as virtuous? You actually lead a better, happier, and more flourishing life if you aren't virtuous, but are regarded as virtuous. In other words, being virtuous really doesn't lead to eudaimonia, only being regarded as virtuous does. If this is right, and the wicked person who lives a life of luxury lives a better life, we're forced to ask the question of this lecture: why bother being good? Why bother being moral in the first place, or being virtuous? Why not just be concerned with living the easy life and not worry about being virtuous and living a morally good life? To understand this question, we're going to look to Plato's Republic, because the overarching argument of the entire work is that the common idea that Glaucon identifies is wrong. Being virtuous, or just as Plato would put it, really is the only way to be the happiest that you can be, the way to lead the most flourishing and worthwhile life. It's the only way to achieve eudaimonia. And even if you're not regarded by the public as virtuous, and instead are scorned, you're still better off being virtuous, even better off than the wicked person